Awesome. Okay. Well, thanks all for joining us. 7 o'clock Victorian time. I know it's not the same time across the country or in New Zealand, but thank you for joining us at whatever time it is at your end. We really appreciate it. This is our March open discussion on lessons management, which is a topic very dear to my heart. So I'm very excited to share that with all of you and hear from all of you in this conversation as well. So I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I extend that respect to Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander or Māori people who may be here with us today. I'd also like to acknowledge that we welcome everyone to today's event, women, diverse women and all allies of women, including men. The Australasian Women in Emergencies Network promotes, supports and recognises the contributions of women in emergency management and disaster resilience across Australasia. Now, you might not all be members of OAR. I hope you are, but I know we do advertise this on the socials. So if some of you aren't members of OAR, that's totally fine. I will post in the chat the link so that you can easily join OAR should you wish to do so. The organisation offers, it's free to join, and we offer scholarships. We're about to start our scholarship process for through Philippa Wolf for an emergency management diploma. And we also offer a mentoring program that's getting a bit of a refresh, but we have some really great mentees and mentors and run heaps of events like this. So if you are interested, I'll pop that in the chat. And I'll hand over to Carla, who's going to kick off tonight's event. So thanks all.
Thank you very much, Lisa. So I'm Carla. I own a small consultancy up here in Queensland called C3 Resilience. And last year, we approached the OAR network to provide some sponsorship or support to or through the donation of 4 tickets to the Lessons Management Forum that's being held in Canberra this year in June. And that's run by the Australasian Institute of Disaster Resilience, or AIDA. That my consultancy has been associated with for a few years now. So we were really keen to give back to the community and have 4 tickets on offer for that forum this year. So to coincide with the release of the giveaway, we thought that it was timely to hold an open discussion on lessons and lessons management to focus on the topic and to try and make lessons a little bit more accessible to the community and open up some really interesting discussions from across the network. So I will be popping the link into the chat shortly and would encourage all of you or any of you to apply for that. You do need to be an OAR member, so please use the link that Lisa's popped in the chat to join us if you haven't already, and we look forward to getting your entries. Those entries are open now, and they close 5 p.m. Monday the 10th of April, and we'll be announcing them on Wednesday the 12th of April, so that there's plenty of time for you to organise getting down to Canberra if you are one of the successful recipients. So this evening, we have invited a couple of speakers to join us just to set the scene, and then we'll throw the discussion open to the rest of you with some questions and discussion points for us to all go through. So first of all, I would like to invite Dr. Claire Cooper just to give a brief overview of who she is and where she comes from.
Thanks, Carla. Hopefully you can all hear me and that the basketball going on in my house in the background doesn't come through too much. Thanks for having me. This is very exciting. Again, I've worked with Lisa for a long time. It's also a passion area of mine. I'm currently the Director of Policy and Planning at ESTA, so 000 Services Call Taking Dispatch in Victoria. I was at Emergency Management Victoria up until last year, doing quite a lot of work on lessons management over the years, and so self-confessed lessons nerds, and so really enjoy the chance to talk about that, and also the connection with gender and diversity, which is something I sort of hadn't made the link before and thought through. So really interested to hear all of your experiences as well as share some of ours. Thanks, Carla.
Thanks, Claire. And Sally Pinder, over to you as our second panel.
Thank you, Carla. Hi, everyone. Very nice to meet you all online on this lovely balmy evening here in Canberra. So I am currently the Acting Director of the National Crisis Exercising and Lessons Capability. I think I got that mouthful out correctly, with the National Emergency Management Agency. And I have come up through emergency management through the Australian Maritime Safety Authority, which is where I met Mark Cuthbert and then Lisa and then Heather from New South Wales SES, and joined this amazingly named little lessons nerd herd. And I'm very excited to come and share my experiences with you today and hear what you all have to say. Thanks, Carla.
Thanks, Sally, and back to you, Claire, as well. Thank you. I suppose a brief introduction for me as well. I've been in the DM space since about 2015, and a self-confessed lessons nerd since also meeting Mark Cuthbert and his posse of people, including Lisa and Adair and Mark Ryan and other people in that sort of sphere. So I'm most particularly passionate about DM and lessons in health, and how we can integrate that through there. So Lisa, I will throw back to you to get us started on the discussion part.
No worries, thanks Carla. And I'll just quickly introduce myself. So Lisa Jackson, I'm on the OAR Network Committee, and I'm proud to be so and have been involved for the last few years. I also work for Emergency Management Victoria and have since 2014. Spent a lot of years with Claire, as she mentioned, and originally wrote a master's thesis on lessons management, and it was a case study on CFA. I was with CFA at the time. And since really discovering the lessons management world, haven't really looked back, and am very passionate and could talk about it for hours and hours, but I won't do that to you tonight. This really is an opportunity for you all to have a conversation with us and across the group. So what I'll do is we've got one question for Claire and Sally particularly, and then we'll open it up more broadly. So Claire and Sally, how does your organisation implement lessons, or what examples have you seen, and how have you overcome any barriers to learning? So who wants to go first? Claire.
I'm happy to jump in. So I am currently at Esther, or sort of 000 Victoria Services. I've only been there 4 or 5 months, so I won't talk too much about what they do, because I think it's still a bit of a work in progress in terms of building that internally. But certainly in my role at Emergency Management Victoria, Lisa and I worked together to develop the first lessons management framework for Victoria, which was really all hazards, all emergencies. There was quite a strong culture across the sector in Victoria of identifying lessons, or at least identifying some form of lessons, doing lots of debriefs, busy work, identifying things, but really challenged and not particularly mature in sharing those across agencies, or even knowing where they were internal in a single agency, and then creating change from those lessons. So our work was based on and influenced the National Handbook of Lessons Management. So that's kind of the Bible that we base all our work on, which has had input from all of the people you've heard mention. And also Lisa's master's thesis had a big influence on the work that we did. So we wanted to use research and sort of demonstrate good practice. And then the ADAR handbook really became quite a strong sort of guiding set of principles for us, and it was really useful to have that national approach. We then would say, well, no, you can't do it the way you want to do it, because it's a national approach and we have to do it this way, because otherwise we're not going to be able to share and be consistent nationally. So we really used that to our advantage. So we had the framework that we built, and a lot of this is in the handbook as well, was really around the process. So we defined some core pieces around identifying lessons, and then not talking about lessons learnt until you actually know they are. So you might identify a whole lot of things, but if you can't show that it's actually created any change, we haven't actually learned anything. So we try not to react physically to that terminology, but sometimes a bit tricky. So those two sort of cycles that work together to be able to implement lessons is sort of the second core piece. But then supporting that was a set of cultural characteristics, particularly based on Lisa's research. It was really clear that, sorry, someone's called a goal in the background. Unless you have the cultural foundations for learning and lessons and continuous improvement or whatever it's called, it doesn't really matter what the language is. Lessons management is something that us lessons nerds use, but actually it doesn't really matter as long as people are committed to learning and improving and being open to sharing their experiences, both positive and not so positive. So we had a set of cultural characteristics that we were working towards embedding in the sector as much as possible and in our organisation specifically. So they were around just fair, leadership, accountability, communication, and having a learning focused organisation. And we also were quite conscious at the start that we wanted it to be, we had a big vision, but we also wanted to chip away and get some little wins as well. So a little bit about overcoming those barriers, which primarily was resistance to change and concern with sharing and being sort of vulnerable, not only internally in an organisation, but across organisations. It was really challenging to build that awareness and understanding and trust across agencies. So we had to come up with ways that people were willing to share even internally. So a few of the examples which I can talk more about, we did a lot of social events. Anything involving food seemed to go quite well. We started a series of events called Bring a Plate and a Lesson. So we tried to make it quite informal and sort of a drop-in, and we had a few themes, I think, from memory, about, come along, it's not too scary, you don't have to share everything, but just bring something that you want to share on this particular topic and a plate of food. And so no cost really to the organisation, just some time of people and some commitment from us to kind of set it up. We did a lot of case studies. We found it was really useful to capture positive stories, so things that went well, even though there might have been some things that could be improved within that or near misses. So we stayed really clear until we were dragged into it eventually, but we stayed clear of the big reviews, the big inquiries, and really stuck to some of the smaller stories, some of the things that have worked well, again, to try and make it less scary or intimidating for people, and then people could see why they might share something. And in every event, of course, there's always things that could have gone better or could be improved as well that were worth picking up. But we had a lot more success sharing some of the positive stories and some of the not so controversial events, if you like, and being able to share some case studies quite transparently. Lisa did a lot of newsletters and a lot of communications, and again, to quite a broad audience, so not keeping it to just people that we directly worked with, but having quite a big audience and being quite transparent about the work that we were doing. We did a flyer called What Can I Do? So again, we're kind of trying to keep it quite simple. So what are some little things that you can do to build a learning culture in your team or your area? And they involve some of those things like tell someone else a story about something you've learnt from, read a case study, I've forgotten the others, but those kinds of things. So we wanted to make it sort of accessible in terms of language and not be too prescriptive about what people called things, or, is it a debrief or an after action review, for example? Well, we didn't really mind too much about what people called it. We wanted people to be learning and sharing rather than being too worried about terminology, even if sometimes we wanted to be prescriptive. We tried to sort of be quite open to people coming at whatever point they were at. And the same with organisations. Again, they sort of ebbs and flows of different organisations, including the one we were working in, about the support and the level of commitment at executive level, for example, and you know, as people come and go from different places, the maturity of lessons management can really change over time. So again, that was okay, and it was just sort of meeting people where they needed it, talking through the concepts again many times, and we sort of always were happy to do that, particularly given that's our sort of passion area now at a new organisation. It's not something that they've got really deeply embedded, and starting to chip away at, even though it's not really my job, but starting to try and get it into all of the various conversations and demonstrate why there's value in it and what it can bring to the organisation. So that's probably enough for me to start with. I'm happy to answer any questions, obviously. I'll let Sally talk.
In the chat though, Claire.
Okay.
And maybe it's something to think about, and while we throw to Sally, what lessons have surprised you? So I'll come back to that. Sally, over to you.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, Claire. I thought I might just talk you all through my journey a little bit. So I've only just joined the National Emergency Management Agency, and actually when I joined them in July last year, they were Emergency Management Australia. So at the beginning of September, the government put the recovery side of response, so the National Recovery and Resilience Agency and Emergency Management Australia, the response side of the response, back together in the same agency. And so we're still processing a few of those machinery of government changes. So I was 3 months into learning EMA, and now I'm 3 months into learning EMA and recovery, and I have no experience in recovery, so there's plenty for me to explore and investigate. I have a real passion for learning. I'm a very curious person, and I started off in private industry, in law firms, large consultancies, really working in knowledge management, IT, HR, business analysis. And I eventually found myself at the Australian Maritime Safety Authority in marine pollution response, so a very niche market of response. And I had no idea about emergency response, and I fell down this wonderful rabbit hole of very interesting and exciting work. And as part of that, so I worked in marine pollution response and also with our Search and Rescue Centre, which coordinates search and rescue, aviation and maritime for Australia. And in the last few years there, as I said, I met Mark Cuthbert, and I discovered this world of lessons and the ADAR Lessons Management Handbook. And I brought with me all of my previous language, which was continuous improvement, quality assurance, learning. I had a background in learning and development and training, and it all fit perfectly. And here I am nerding out in lessons with NEMA. So we are, I'm still in the emergency management and response group with NEMA. So there are two parts to my role. As I mentioned, I'm part of the exercising and lessons capability. So that's at a national crisis level view. And so we have a strategy where we're looking at capability uplift across both areas and really supporting Australian government agencies and state and territory agencies to build capability in that space. So that's our long-term objective. At the same time, because we have become NEMA, we're looking at what does our internal lessons capability look like and our strategy look like. So we do a lot of things organically, and I would like to put some framework and structure around it so that I can track the evidence and tell the stories and follow the data trails. So what do we do with lessons? Well, we follow the ADAR Lessons Management Handbook. So we follow the OIL process, observations, insights, lessons identified and then learned. And I do twitch and I do get laughed at work. The great thing is that what I find culturally is everyone wants to learn. They want to do it better than it happened last time. And so we're we get lots of responses where we gather data through surveys, after action reviews, interviews, all the usual means. I actually have 2 staff assigned in my team to help with lessons, which is amazing. So there's 3 of us. I shall build an empire. I'll ask the boss for some more shortly, but I'm training them up. And so we analyze all of that data, form some insights. And then where we're at now, it is a kind of, it depends. So if it's small and internal, the depends might be that we create a dashboard report of those insights, and the team might take those continuous improvement activities and manage them for themselves, which has the advantages of they can own the outcomes, but also the advantage for us that we are still consolidating the data and keeping a big picture. And the other depends is we may need to produce a report. So we may need to take it all the way through to lessons identified and a report, and then take it upstairs for a chat about how we're going to put it into our continuous improvement program. I think a place that I'd really like to get to is where we can talk, I don't know whether it will be a lessons board or a lessons executive group, something like that, where we can talk about, here's what's on the radar that we've identified, here's our organisational priorities around risk, let's pick the, you know, the top 1 or the top 3 or the things that we can actually implement in this time period, because there's always going to be more lessons, and the ones we've identified aren't going to go away. So one of the challenges that we face is how do we bring all of this information down to a bite-sized piece of work that we can feel like we succeed at, and we can see a success story and a change at the other end. So that's around about where I'm at, talking with the executive in that space, noting that we're still pushing 2 agencies into the same space. So I'm moving slowly so as not to overwhelm the change in people, and just chipping away at the culture of let's capture the lessons, let's capture the data, and let's make one small change before next time. In terms of barriers, I think the barriers that I've encountered over both of my main roles are really just back to the same ones we encounter in every project: time, resourcing, budget. How do we get the work prioritized? How do we get some time and resources to implement the change? And my conclusion that I've drawn all on my own with my 5 years of experience is that it just needs to be part of that, our normal business culture. So at NEMA, it's really pleasing to see all the teams at the end of a process go, oh, we need to capture some lessons or capture some data, and regardless of what they call it, whether it's continuous improvement or operational improvement. So that culture is in there, but how do we make that culture then just part of usual business practice? So it's just an accepted piece of the process of a piece of work that comes with the resourcing and the time and the budget for that piece of work. I think that's the view that I formed. I have no magical solutions though. So I'm just testing and playing and pushing and see where I end up, and drawing on good friends and colleagues and people with new ideas to see if they've got something that I can use. And then after I work some magic with NEMA and get my processes in order, I'm really looking at what could we do nationally, and that's where I'm really going to start drawing, hopefully from this network, but definitely from the network of lessons people who have supported me to get to this point, to say what does national lessons look like. We have some past activities that were done with EMA before I started, so learning from those, learning from the data we've got, and identifying a pathway forward. That's me, I think, for that question.
Thanks, Sally. And what I love about what both you and Claire have described is all of the different ways that we can approach lessons management. I know that we have the super structured OIL methodology, which can sometimes be terrifying to people because it's a lot to implement. But if we go back to the other side, which is let's just get people together and share and learn from each other. And that's really the start of the journey, right? So, and then there's everything in between to help us with learning lessons moving forward. So thank you both so much for sharing. Claire, I don't know if you've had any thoughts about what lessons have surprised you?
I've been racking my brain because honestly, after a little while, the themes don't shift that much, unfortunately. So I always say that the themes remain the same, but what's within the theme and the issues that are being raised gradually get better, you know, that things improve over time. And so one of the ways we tried to sort of communicate that, because that can be quite difficult, this sort of black hole of where does all this stuff go, nothing ever changes in relation to what individuals provide as observations, can be really challenging. And one of, I think, the greatest barriers to continuous improvement processes and lessons management. And one of the ways we tried to address that was talking about the theme and things, how things had evolved over time. So a good example is kind of evacuation in Victoria, where things were really challenging, policies changed, then they were challenging in different ways, policies changed again, and over time, the way we talk about and think about evacuations has changed over time. Traffic management's another good example, getting into sort of operational examples, where public information is another one in Victoria, where things have shifted such a long way over what's reasonably short period of time. There's still some big challenges, and so it's still a theme that comes up in every single process, but the things that are raised are quite different, and that the way that we understand that and what we see as the challenges have shifted over time. So trying to tell that longer term story, but in terms of actual surprises of lessons, not that much. One of the things that really surprised us, though, when we set up our online system that supports capturing observations and then doing the analysis, we included in there an option to be anonymous. But after thousands of observations, at least you might know the stats, but very few people chose to submit observations anonymously, which was a big surprise to us. We thought people would want to be able to raise their concerns or their observations anonymously, and most of the time people were very open about their views and quite even-handed. There were a few we had to kind of adjust, but most of the time people, as Sally said, genuinely want to contribute to our sector improving or the system improving, and are kind of conscious that this is a systemic challenge. With these themes are systemic, they're not about individuals doing XYZ. It really is about trying to improve the system as a whole. And so that was probably the biggest surprise about the fact that people were really willing to contribute, and often would put their contact details to say, you know, happy for this to be followed up and talk in more detail about their observations.
Amazing, thanks, Claire. No, I'm keen to hear from anyone on the call that wants to also share about if your organisation has an approach to learning or how you've overcome barriers to learning that you want to share. Feel free to pop your hand up or turn your camera on and share away. Otherwise, we'll move to the next question if anyone wants to share. No, well, maybe over to you, Carla, for the next question.
All right, thanks, Lisa. I thought I might just share a little something about how I've seen some organisations implement lessons. And yeah, there's definitely been a fresh approach over the last few years of people really wanting to learn and implement, which I think is quite refreshing. I think, Claire, you mentioned that initially there was some fear around being vulnerable and sharing things that have gone wrong. And what I'm seeing across a lot of organizations now is people being more willing to be open and share what did go wrong so that others can learn from that before it goes wrong for them too. So I just thought I would share that little one. But our question for the whole call now, and again, we'd love you to speak up, because this is all about hearing from across the network and across Australia and New Zealand, is, has there been any gender bias observed in your organisation when it comes to lessons? And that could be through the identification process or the implementation process, whether there's been any gender bias. Lisa, I think you mentioned something a couple of weeks ago when we caught up around the soft skills when it comes to debriefing. Did you want to expand on that a little bit?
Oh, well, just when we originally were talking about this open discussion, and it came to mind, well, you know, this is I guess a group that brings together women or allies of women around the issues that women face. And so it made me think about lessons management and the role of gender bias. And I just had never thought about it before. And then Claire and I got talking about this particular issue, and we started to slowly identify situations where we might have experienced that. So Claire, I don't know if you want to share. I know we've got quite an infamous story about a Google pen, but I don't know if you've got any other stories.
I'm happy to. I mean, it's the best story,
Yeah.
best and worst story. But I agree. We've been working in this space for 8 years, nearly 10 years, maybe more than that. And it was the first time, really, which it shouldn't have been, but it was the first time I'd started thinking about the gender, the subtle ways that gender influences in lessons management. And I think it's maybe not as obvious as some other areas of the emergency management, disaster management sector, and so which has some real structural issues. And so maybe hasn't had the same level of attention, or maybe we just haven't been, you know, cognizant of it. But I thought it was really interesting to start thinking about, particularly early in our careers, about having to really hold the space to do facilitation, for example. So facilitating a debrief was always an operational person's job, usually an older male, and it was really confronting the first few times that we were offered to do that or said we were going to do that, and quite challenging to kind of step into that and take on that role and be confident, or at least pretend to be confident to do those roles that weren't traditionally, certainly in the organisations we were working in, weren't roles that traditionally were done by women, and particularly young women, you know, who would usually be doing the scribing or the analysis in the back room, or whatever those sort of less seen as, you know, lesser roles. We deliberately call the role that captures the conversation scribes, rather than any of the other words that might be used, note takers, or, you know, whatever those are, because we see it as real skill, and it definitely is, and it's real skill that needs to be developed. You can tell if people are strong in that scribing role, and it makes such a difference to the output. But one of the examples, sort of the worst example that we've seen, and it was quite a few years ago, Lisa and I went, as newly at Emergency Management Victoria, went to support some colleagues in an agency who were running a big debrief, and there was, I don't know, maybe 100 people there, and we had come along to support the process and really sort of review the process to be able to build it into our lessons management work that we were doing. So we were there as observers and guests, and one of the quite senior male operational personnel came over to us and started off asking us whether we were the admin girls, I think was the language. I think in my head I say admin chicks, but I'm sure that wasn't what he said. But basically asked us if we were here to take notes, which we said we weren't. But then he went on to tell us about this new technology that you can get from Google, which is a pen. And a Google pen will you can write with it, and it will transcribe for you and put the notes into an online document and describe this quite at length to us, of which I was so shocked. I don't think any of us said anything until we got in the car on the way back and started processing what had happened. But the story of the Google Pen, they became a bit of folklore in the organisation, and the story spread, and so there was a lot of people offering us information about the Google Pen, and it still remains a bit of a sad joke, really, that continues to be told about the sort of assumptions that are made and the information that's shared with us that we had no interest in. So if you have any stories, you can tell us stories. If you have any about friends of yours or people that you know, if you don't want to share them about your organisation. But I'm really keen to hear if anyone's thought more about this. And also, as I was starting to think about aspects of diversity and inclusion that we should have thought about and we hadn't. So disabilities, for example, how do we make sure people with various needs are included in this work? And it just wasn't something that we've focused on, and we should have. So certainly in the future, that'll be something I start to think about as well.
Thanks, Claire. So I don't know if anyone else has anything to share. I know there's lots of questions coming through in the chat, so Sally and Claire, feel free to jump in there too.
Anne, you've got your hand up. We'd love to hear from you.
So one of the, it's not obviously gendered, but one of the issues, so I'm with Fire and Rescue New South Wales. One of the issues I have is that when we talk about lessons learned, it's always operational. So trying to actually get anyone to think about, maybe we could learn some lessons about our administrative processes, which oddly enough, a lot of them are not run by men, and they're not run by uniforms, and they don't involve shiny toys. It basically, it's out of scope. Sorry, we don't do that. It's out of scope for our lessons learned, which is called operational improvement. It's only interested in improving operations. So it's a indirect bias, but yeah. And I think somebody in the last OAR meeting I was at talked about women talking out in like town hall meetings, and debriefs after action reviews are often held in a meeting room with a whole batch of people there. I'm not sure that that's a gender equal space. Maybe we need to think about some other ways to do some of that. Because as somebody said in the chat, you know, the loudest voice generally gets heard, and you have that whole thing about rank as well. So if somebody of higher rank starts speaking, everybody else shuts up, and they won't contradict him. It's usually him. So there's actually quite a few, not necessarily overt issues, but yeah, people on the outside of things like that. The other thing I have found, though, in terms of facilitation, is that if you put the wrong man facilitating, things can get really angry very fast because he's seen as telling them what to do or what they should have done, and telling them they got it wrong. And that can go down the gurgler really, really fast.
Thanks, Anne. Those are some really interesting observations. And I think you're right. Whilst they're not overt, it would be interesting to dig a little deeper to see where that sits. And yeah, is it purely because it's not operational that you're not being part of the lessons process, or is it because there's no men in there who see it as value and choosing to add it to scope? And I do wonder how much that actually does occur unconsciously, with that unconscious bias through other organisations that, as you said, aren't overt, but are certainly sitting there. And as you unpick them and analyse it, the gender bias does show through. Has anyone else got any stories or observations from their time in organisations? No? All right.
Sharon might
oh.
actually. Oh, we
Sorry.
can't hear you, Sharon. Okay, maybe write in the chat, Sharon, or go have a go at dialing in with your phone, maybe for communications.
And if you get it working, happy to come back to that question and what you've got to say. So we'd love to hear it. Still nothing. So Ashley has just said that she also notices that a lot of lessons around the community engagement and liaison often get lost as well because they're not operational. And obviously those roles are frequently carried out by women as well. So that's a really interesting point. So thank you for that, Ashley. Shall we move on to the next discussion point, unless someone else has some more examples of gender bias that they might have seen?
I might just add to a couple of things that Anne mentioned, and it was something that we particularly found, Claire and I, when we can hear you, Sharon, I think. Or maybe not. Are you there, Sharon? No, that's okay. When we first started our processes with lessons management, and the comments you made, Anne, around having the right facilitator, and the amount of times I heard, particularly in my master's research, around people had turned up to debriefs and the operational person would get up at the start and say, oh, well, we know this event went really well, so we'll just now jump into the debrief. And so has already kind of set the scene that their expectation is that the event went well. So if anyone was to contradict that, and they wouldn't because of rank, it wouldn't be welcomed, would be how it was felt. So that's when Claire and I spent a lot of time trying to edge our way in, or change who the facilitators would be to give more of a objective, I guess, environment to the conversation, so that the person who's running it hasn't actually been involved at all. And therefore it kind of puts everyone on an even playing field. And then also that the town hall debriefs are a definite like pet peeve of mine. And the comments around, you know, often it's the loudest person in the room that gets heard during those processes. And that's something that I think the lesson space has worked really hard to try and shift a little bit. And I think COVID's made that a bit more challenging, because we're having to, you know, run debriefs and forums like this, which, you know, can be really challenging for someone, again, to step up in a virtual room full of people. But we did a lot of work around, I guess, divide and conquering, using kind of workshop methodology with, I guess, facilitators at tables to try and break down that the fear of having to speak up in front of others, and having more smaller conversations to capture those learnings. And post-it notes. I feel like anyone who's in the lesson space loves a post-it note, because then you can write down your experience and start posting those around the room and not having to actually verbally say it. But it's obviously been a lot harder in a virtual environment. Claire, did you have your hand up?
I was going to say the exact same thing about the methodology. But also just to get a little bit nerdy about lessons management process, because it's based on trends and observations to insights to lessons. It is a trends-based process of analysis at its heart. And so every observation has equal weight. So even if there is one louder person, and you can kind of potentially manage that through that sort of workshop style tables, small groups, not have people grandstanding for a long time, which is kind of the only way it used to be done, certainly in our experience. By having the sort of analysis process, then the true trends come to light, and it isn't just about what everyone's heard in the room and sort of a couple of loud voices. It does give people the opportunity to really look at, you know, what does the data tell us. and also different ways of capturing the data and the observation. So we've used, as Sally kind of mentioned, lots of different ways that different people can provide input, that's not just having to speak up in the room, including with the community. The last couple of learning review processes we've done have included community surveys, which again have some challenges because of the way, sort of single way of getting data, but better than not including it at all. And it means that we have a sort of different set of information that tells us something about the community's experience of the emergency, not just what we've found internally. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Claire. Should we jump into the next one, Carla?
Yeah, let's do it. What is our next one, Lisa?
I know, I'm looking at the list, but I'm also looking at the chat, and there's a really great question in the chat. So I think we
Let's
might
go
jump
with
to this
that.
one. Okay.
Sounds great.
Would be great to hear more about developing a culture of learning through those in leadership positions and any practical examples. Sally, have you got any examples for that one? And then obviously anyone else in the call, start getting your thinking caps on.
Thanks, Lisa. So I think I've just responded. My main observation in that space is I've really found that it's leaders who champion either learning or change or whatever the term is that works in that organization. So my experience has been that there's a leader who just incorporates it into their normal daily language. So their language with their teams, their language with the executives, and they just treat it as this thing that is just a part of everyday business life. But then they advocate for it as well with their colleagues. And that's the shift that then I start to see, because it flows down into their teams, so their teams feel comfortable asking for it or questioning it. And you see it kind of trigger the awareness in other leaders and executives. So if I was to go into a new organization, I don't really need to at NEMA, because I've got plenty of executives, perhaps too many, with a vested interest in what I'm doing. It's a little nerve-wracking at times. But if I was to go into a new organization, I would try to find that person who's already committed, already passionate, and see if they could help me, start to change the language at a leadership level. I think that's the experience that I would take from where I've been into where I would go.
Thanks, Sally.
Any questions, comments?
Carla's got her hand up.
Yeah, I don't know if my example is how they've developed a culture, but what I've found really useful is I've had the sort of fortunate experience of coming in as that independent person who's doing the after action review. And when an organization engages someone independent or someone outside of the organization, people seem to be more willing to listen to what comes from those sort of review processes or the lesson side of things. I recently worked with an organization that was quite blame heavy internally, and there was a lot of finger pointing and a lot of sort of displeasure between people. And what we found when we came in as this sort of independent body, talking with people individually or in small groups rather than those large town halls like we spoke about before, was that people were more willing to open up because it was relatively anonymous, or it wasn't going to be pushed back onto them as saying what was going wrong. But then the leadership were also more open to hearing what was being said, sort of in that final report where we did then go through those themes, because as you said, it's that trends-based process, and all of these trends came out that weren't so favourable, but leadership was more willing to listen to it because it came from an independent source using a trusted methodology. So I think if you can do the process and show the worth, that sometimes that can start building that trust in the process, and developing that culture where people want to do more of it. So yeah, that's just my 2 cents in my last experience.
Yeah, I agree. The amount of times that I've had to say, well, this insight or this learning was informed by 25 different observations that we've captured in, 3 different locations by 20 odd different staff to be able to, quantify the importance of that particular issue when it hasn't always been, you'll get the comments, oh, well, I didn't believe that was an issue at the time. And it's like, well, this is what we've heard from the people. So I think it was an issue. And it has really
Absolutely.
helped. It has helped.
There's nothing like pulling out the spreadsheet when someone questions an insight and you're going, well, this is the data that backed it up, to really go, look, this is a sound methodology, and getting people on board and on the journey.
Absolutely. What about anyone else? Sharon, is your technology working? Do you want to give it another go? No, I'm sad. There is a question in the chat. Is there any examples of community surveying or capturing learnings from community? Does anyone have any examples? Oh, Sharon, I wish we could hear you.
I'm happy to talk to it, but it really is something that you led, Lisa, so you might want to talk to it as well. But as part of the June 2021 storm event in Victoria, we did quite an extensive review process after that, and it included doing phone surveys of community members from the impacted areas. So for your background, it was a widespread storm and flooding impact across numerous parts of Victoria. So we engaged a third-party company who did market research type style of capturing information, and they contacted community members in those areas randomly, and then did a number of follow-up deep dive interviews, so online survey and then a few deep dive interviews. And we also collected information through the councils who were doing sort of drop-in sessions, information sessions and questions as well. And so we collated that and included it in the report. So there's a community report that's available on the Emergency Management Victoria website, which we're very proud of. It took quite a long time, not so much to do the work, although that did take a long time, but to get clearance to provide it publicly, even though it was a public commitment that was made in the aftermath of the event. So we were, as I said earlier, we were lucky. It was sort of one step below an inquiry, but important enough that we were able to push through the need to share it back with the community, collect it from the community and share it back with the community. So it was sort of at the right level to be able to do things. And I think I was just thinking back about that leadership question, that we've been through cycles of willingness to be transparent as a sector and as an organisation. And I think that's certainly one of the things, one of the success factors for us early on was a willingness as an organisation to be quite open and transparent with things that hadn't gone so well, and that over times has shifted, and that's made it quite tricky. And I think that can be one of the real major barriers where organisations start getting worried about the things that they're sharing and the potential for those things to be shared in different forums and with the media. And I think that can have a really difficult impact, and you really do need strong leadership, organisational leadership, to make sure you don't kind of undermine the whole process of learning by not wanting to be transparent. I know there's a balance, there's a point at which you can need to be sort of careful, but I think that's been tricky over the years about where we can share and what we'd like to share. Everything agencies, as you know, and most of the people we talk to are willing to share, but as an organisation, often less so.
Yeah, and I mean, we've been through such a journey of like capturing learnings from the community and what that looks like and what's the best way to do it. And after the Southwest fires in 2017, we did a really resource intensive process of running community debriefs at multiple locations. And it was the most like beautiful thing I've ever been involved in. And I would love to do it more, but it just is quite unrealistic from our level, I think, and the limited staffing that we've got. But we were able to, you know, host what we call drop-in sessions. So it wasn't like an all-in town hall debrief, because often that can be quite scary. People get scared of doing that with community. It was a drop-in time, so people could drop in after picking up the kids from school or before, that kind of thing. We had a little corner with like kids' toys. So if someone had like young kids, they could keep them occupied. We had tea and coffee and biscuits on offer, so people could just feel relaxed. We had a number of representatives of agencies, but not too many, because you don't want someone to walk in and just see a wall of uniforms either. So it was a fine balance of just having a small number of agency reps. And we particularly had someone from like Red Cross that always has amazing soft skills and communicative skills in those types of situations. And we just, I guess, allowed the community to share their experiences during that particular fire, you know, what aspect of it worked well, what could be improved. They had a wall where they could put up pictures or post-it notes about their experiences, you know, where they were on the night, that type of thing. And it just told this amazing story. And so we were able to use that to inform our report as a source of information. And it was fabulous, but it was extremely resource intensive. And I think what the process that Claire described, where we were able to utilize forums that were already being held through local government after the June storm, worked a lot better, where we could just ensure that, you know, where communities were coming together already, we just enabled them to share those types of learnings in the same context when they might also be asking about relief and recovery services and things like that. So we've, I guess, seen that evolve slowly, but I know a number of you work a lot with community, so you might have other experiences to share as well.
That's a great point, Lisa, that sometimes the community input is so resource intensive, even though it brings such deep observations and understanding of what actually went on, rather than the bias that we hold as potentially the responders or the people that come through before, during or after it. We worked with an organisation a couple of years ago that was hoping to do some town hall type situations, but COVID got in the way during all of the lockdown periods and things like that. And they reverted to a simple online survey through their council website, and actually got quite good engagement with community members just completing that. And they had the option to leave their details for a follow-up phone call or email if they wanted to share more information. So it can be one end of the spectrum to the other. It can be a simple online survey with a follow-up, or it can be a complex in-person drop-in event, or whatever that looks like. But I think it's important to note that there's no one right way to do it, and it's always going to depend on the resources you've got and the community you're working with. Oh, Claire, I'm glad I'm not the only one having problems with replying in the chat, because it's not working for me. So we are coming to the end of our time, but Farah has actually asked a really good question in the chat, which is, would organisations be more willing to share if they already have actions underway to address or have the lead time to do this? Lisa, Sally, Claire, I'll get you to think about any of your experiences. From my experience, yes, I think I have seen a few organisations where if they've got something underway, or they can say that they've completed something, they're much more willing to share. But as I said earlier, that there is sort of this bigger uptake of organisations being vulnerable in sharing their information early before they've even started doing any implementation. But Lisa, Sally, Claire, anything from you guys?
I will jump in, Carla. I actually don't have an answer. I'm puzzling this one out, trying to think what my experiences have been, because I don't know that I've been involved in a process where we've gone to publish it publicly, and so I haven't encountered any resistance in publishing internally. I think yes, if you're releasing a report and you can say, and this is where we're up to already, or this is what we've started, it gives that positive news story with it, which is easier to share, rather than generating a whole bunch of questions on, that's great, but what are you doing about it? So I imagine if I had my CEO executive hat on, my personal response would be, okay, so if we're going to release the report, let's also release the what we've started doing, not just what we intend to do about it. But I am sadly lacking in experience on this question, but now I'm very curious. So my work is going to love you next week when I run around asking questions about what's happened in the past. And maybe I can bring some information back later, or it's a question if you can get to the Lessons Management Forum. Maybe it's a question that we can answer in June. That's not very helpful, but that's my story.
It's a good question. I think what we found with we obviously did quite a big review after the June 2021 storm and impacts of that. And one thing that we identified through that process that has worked really well is the huge amount of consultation we did with agencies at each stage of the process. So we also asked agencies to do their own after action reviews and to share those with us. And then we were able to collate them across agencies along with the community information and multi-agency debriefs. But then once we started to identify what the trends were, we then went back to subject matter experts or the personnel that contributed to the event to validate what we were identifying. You know, are we on the right track? Do we understand the problems? Do we not? Help us wordsmith some of these trends. And then once we got to the lesson stage, we did it again, but in a much more formal approach where I think it was a whole week we had dedicated to the 50 lessons that we identified and sharing those. And we had a very open invite. We're like, if you want to come along to a validation session about lessons to do with the June storm, please come. And so we broke it up by theme. We had 12 themes, and in each session, we would present the lesson and we would go through, and it might have felt painful for some because we were wordsmithing lesson by lesson over a series of 5 days, but it was the most valuable process we've ever gone through, because all of the agencies that turned up and were able to share their experience and see their experience in the lessons and ensure that they did represent their experience was just awesome. And it helped us with, even though, you know, approval processes are still approval processes and they take time, but I feel like we still had a much smoother ride because of all of the consultation we did up until that point. And therefore, when we really got to the community report, we were dealing with very minor wordsmithing changes at that point to get everyone comfortable for release. So, I mean, we did have dedicated staff working on that, and as a lot of this work is quite resource intensive, but it was a really valuable process.
Thanks, Lisa. All right, well, we've hit 7:05 in my time, 8:05 for you Southerners, and I'm not sure what time you are in New Zealand, but it must be later.
Yeah.
It must be late. Oh, Jennifer, 10 o'clock. Okay. Really want to thank you all for your time today. It's been great to hear from Sally, Claire, Lisa, and Anne. I'm sorry that, Sharon, we couldn't hear you. And I hope that it's been valuable to everyone else online. I'm sorry we didn't get to hear your stories, because everybody does have something important to share. So save it up for next time, or if something comes to mind over the next couple of days, feel free to flick us an email to info@awenetwork.org.au, because this is something that we're all very nerdy about, and would love to hear your stories. Lisa, I might throw to you if there's anything else before we close off for the evening.
Nothing else, just to fly the flag for the Lessons Management Forum, where all of us will be together in person in Canberra in July. So come and hang out if you're interested and want to know more.
Yep. Don't forget to apply for the free tickets if you are interested. That is for an in-person attendance, but obviously, depending on the circumstances, that might be able to be changed to a virtual ticket. And even if you can't make it in person down to Canberra, they do have the virtual option to the Lessons Management Forum as well. But we will definitely be there and ready to chat about this until you're bored of us.
Absolutely. And there is a lessons management group on LinkedIn. So if you're interested, reach out on LinkedIn. I'll see if I can quickly find the link and pop it in the chat before everyone signs off as well.
Excellent. And yeah, one of the things that we really wanted today to be was about making it more accessible and less scary. So I hope we've done that rather than scare you off. But if you are interested in sort of having a bit more of a one-on-one chat about anything with anyone, we're always more than willing to talk if you would like to do more in your organisations. But thank you all so much. Have a fantastic evening with whatever you're doing for the rest of it.
Thanks all.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.